Okay. Well, to respect everybody's time, we'll get started. And so I guess I'll start by saying that for those of you, I think everybody here other than our presenter has been at an action evening before, but our goal is to finish the main presentation by 8, and that would include the actual presentation and questions and answers. And then at 8, we'll take a short break, and then people are welcome to come back. Before we break, we'll acknowledge our speaker and thank her, and then have a break, and everybody is welcome to come back to have additional discussion on what we've learned. So that's how things are going to look. I'm going to start this evening with a land acknowledgement. So I want to acknowledge that we are here in our own homes, actually, probably in the Vancouver area, but that we are uninvited guests on the stolen lands of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. UCV, our organization, is committed to working in solidarity with Indigenous and other people of color in shifting the colonial default and dismantling the white supremacist patriarchy. So welcome those who are just joining us now. I want to introduce Ngaio, who is joining us to speak today. She's got a fun title to her presentation, but basically she's going to be talking about green burials. And I know Ngaio from a networking group. We've actually probably known each other for at least a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, time flies, eh? Anyways, I would guess the theme of what I think about Ngaio is the road less traveled. So what you will find out more about is that she is actually in what we would call the funeral services industry, but as I'm going to say a renegade, not operating an ordinary funeral services business. But before that, she was what she called a journey person carpenter, and in her 20s. So that would probably also be considered a rather unexpected career for a young woman. She's been in the funeral industry for over 20 years, and she wasn't very happy with the kind of conventional way it was being done. And so she struck off on her own, and she wanted to be able to have really deep, meaningful conversations with people as they transitioned and their loved ones transitioned to out of this life. And so that is what informs her current business. And I would say that my experience with Ngaio is that she's perfect for this. She is a very deep listener and very gentle and kind. And I can just imagine that you would be a really great person to have at that time of a person's life. I also forgot to mention that she was actually a farm girl, and she was born and raised in somewhere in rural BC. So that's all I'm going to say about Ngaio. And like I said, she's going to do a presentation and then a Q&A until around 8 o'clock.
Thank you, Kathy. Thanks so much for your kind words. Appreciate that. And thanks so much for inviting me to be a part of this evening. For me, the idea and the participation in sharing information within community is just important work that we can all do. And I hold it as an important piece of the work that I need to do, because end of life stuff, any conversations around death, it's not juicy stuff. It's not what most people want to think about. It's not what they want to get into. So thank you for taking some time to be here with me tonight. So I'm going to start my talk tonight just by showing a short little, like a video, a slideshow presentation. And then I'll just get into some of the points that are brought up in that presentation and go into that a little more closely. So just bear with me as I do the old screen share. And I think, can everybody see that? There's a head. Yep, okay, we're getting a thumbs up, super. So the title of my talking tonight is Eco-Friendly Endings, the Green New Deal of Deathcare. And I'm going to get into this by looking back at where we were so that we can see where we are now and where we're headed. So 100 years ago, things we possessed, said, believed in, and practiced were entirely different, and maybe even unrecognizable compared to our 2020 lives, including our funeral practices. And by funeral practices, I mean everything, starting with people dying in their homes and then being cared for by their families and community. My grandma, who actually just turned 104 in September, would call it laying out the dead. She described it to me as women from the community gathering in the home of the deceased to wash, dress, and lay out the dead in the home for the rest of the community and the family, of course, to come together to pay their respects and bear witness to the death. We would wear black for more than just the funeral, as a visual sign to let others know who the bereaved were, who was actively grieving. At that time, we would dig the grave by hand, lower the casket into the ground using ropes and people power, and then bury by hand, and often with the participation of many. When possible, natural handmade wood caskets were built by family members or a neighbor, maybe also accompanied by a simply sewn cloth shroud. The common theme in the funeral practices amongst the various communities was the hands-on group effort, providing the essential component of making real the death to all. 100 years ago, our funeral practices were very much community-based. Between then and now, the changes in our funeral practices, as in other life events, have been enormous. We started dying in institutions rather than in our homes, leading to a frequency of our dead never being seen and cared by their families again. Along the way, we began hiring professionals to do our undertaking, minimizing the inconvenience of death by allowing the undertakers or funeral directors to take on more and more of the duties the community used to share in. The care and burial of our bodies has become sterilized and mechanized. Cremation in many areas has become the most common form of disposition. And with that, we have been more easily able to shield ourselves from the finality of death we used to experience when we carried and buried our people in cemeteries. Erroneously, many believe that when cremation is chosen, there cannot be a time made for our families and our friends to come to see our dead before cremation, to pay their respects, and to confront that reality. Our first encounter after learning of the death may only occur when receiving a small yet heavy box containing the ash remains. The costs have risen, on average doubling every 10 years. There are endless options to choose from when it comes to the funeral goods. Metal caskets, hardwood caskets, cardboard caskets, video presentations, memorial cards, the list goes on and on. We industrialized death and turned it into big business. Today, there's a resurgence of interest in our old ways, while simultaneously remodeling them to fit into our 21st century world. A generation of people are poised to reevaluate their needs as it relates to funeral practices. They are seeking meaningful experiences that do more than just satisfy the basic requirements. They are looking for the funeral experience to be as unique and expressive as the life that was lived. Their search is pushing the boundaries of what has become recognized as the conventional funeral practices of the day. They wonder if their eco-friendly practices in life can extend to funerals, asking, why can't we choose to be buried in a simple, earth-friendly, sustainable manner? and then creating natural burial cemeteries because they realize that the big privately owned cemeteries that dominate our urban areas don't even offer that. They're asking after the environmental impact of flame-based cremation and looking into better alternatives such as Aquamation, which uses a solution of 95% water and 5% alkaline solution rather than flame to cremate a body. There's an exploration of the idea of composting our bodies after death as a means to address the dwindling supply of land for full burial in urban areas. And underpinning all of this is the deep need to more completely express their grief. And they're looking for that by way of more personal, hands-on involvement rather than all professional involvement throughout. In essence, they are reclaiming their end-of-life choices. So together, through education, thoughtful conversation, and action, we can affect the change that is needed for fulfilling our eco-friendly end-of-life practices. So why does this all matter? As I wrote, I guess, in the little blurb of what I was hoping to be able to convey this evening, I think this matters because of how fragile we understand now the state of our natural world to be in. We hear conversations regularly around climate action, the need for action, the need to really look at our practices. And many of us are doing those steps or taking those steps. We're doing the best that we can as individuals, and we're calling on our politicians and public service people to take bigger steps for our bigger communities. And so that's why it matters. It matters to me. The unfortunate part for me is that here in BC, regardless of all of these steps that we're taking in our daily lives, when we get to our end-of-life choices, suddenly we don't seem to have the options that we do in our daily life to be able to keep those eco-friendly values going. And it's such a, it's such a stark contrast that the only way I think that we can really start to make changes is if more of us start talking about it, is if people start to understand what are our options, what does that impact mean, and what could better options look like. So here's what's happening now. In BC, we have two legal forms of disposition, and the disposition is the looking after of the body. So right now we can bury or we can cremate. And at least with burial, we have another option. We can choose conventional burial or we can choose green burial. When it comes to cremation, though, we don't have any options. There's only one form of cremation in BC, and that's a flame-based cremation. In Metro Vancouver, at least 80% of people who die end up being cremated. And in other areas of BC, that number is much higher. On Vancouver Island, particularly Southern Vancouver Island, it's more like 90 to 95% of people who die are being cremated. So if going back to Metro Van, if we're talking about that many people being cremated, then you can see that there's such a much smaller number who are being buried. And of those people who are being buried, it's even a smaller number who are actually choosing green burial. Our green burial options in Vancouver are really limited. We have one cemetery in Vancouver itself. Fortunately, it's a very forward-thinking cemetery. It is a conventional cemetery, but they do offer green burial practices within the cemetery. The only other cemetery currently in the Lower Mainland that has green burial options is in South Surrey. Some of the municipalities are starting to look at green burial for their cemeteries, but that's it's a slow moving path, but that is coming. Another factor with burial, period, whether it's conventional or green, is the cost of land. So just like real estate for our own houses, land is a premium in the Lower Mainland. And being buried here is, it takes money. So the cemetery in Vancouver, although it is run and managed by the city of Vancouver, it doesn't mean that it's offering plots at a reduced rate. So to buy a plot for conventional burial or green burial is starting at $25,000. And that price range is all over the map in the Lower Mainland, but that $25,000 isn't even the highest. You're probably looking at lower prices. Well, you are looking at lower prices as you move east out into the Fraser Valley. But for those of us who are closer into Vancouver, the costs for burial are, I think, for many people, they're quite high. When it comes to cremations, as I said, we don't have a choice. There's only one option for cremation. So in this day and age, when we have choices for so many different things, we're building bike paths everywhere, we have the opportunity to buy e-bikes, we can buy electric cars, we're doing virtual meetings now, and you know, clearly that's because of COVID and not because we all necessarily want to. But we're looking at choice, we're experiencing choices that are eco-friendly. But here in BC, when it comes to our end of life, we have very, very limited options. So just a quick, I guess, introduction then to like when I mention these words, conventional burial, green burial, flame-based cremation versus maybe other options, what does that all look like? So conventional burial means that the deceased may or may not be embalmed, and embalming is it's an operation that's performed on the deceased body. It's the introduction of chemicals, and formaldehyde is usually a strong component of one of the chemicals that's introduced into the body. And the purpose of it is for sanitation of the body and for preservation of the body. And there is some reconstructive elements to embalming. So it's not mandatory that one be embalmed, but it often goes hand in hand with burial, and that's just because of some of our traditions and rituals. So the body before burial is then placed into a casket, and the casket is wood or it's metal. Sometimes it's even a precious metal that's chosen. I don't know if any of you recall when Michael Jackson died, he was, of course, I notice these things being the, the funeral geek that I am, but he was buried in a casket called the Promethean that is gold plated. And here in BC, that casket, well, at the time in the funeral home I was working at that actually had one of those, was in the neighborhood of $40,000. So, you know, that's possible that something like that could be purchased for burial. That casket is then, when it's lowered into the ground, it is lowered into some kind of a vault or a liner. So a casket vault or a casket liner is another outer container that's already in the grave, and then the casket is lowered into that. And the purpose of it is to protect the casket for one, but more so to give stability to this hole that has been dug once it's buried back in again, and to keep that even surface on the you know, on the top once it's buried in. You will see individual grave markers in a conventional burial, and they could be flat, they could be upright. You might be able to be buried above the ground, which is what we call entombment. So you'll now have buildings that are placed above the ground as well. Oftentimes, but not always, you will see with conventional cemeteries, it can be quite manicured. So there's lots of maintenance going on, mowers. There's no regulation over how the watering or pesticides or insecticides are used. That's all up to each individual cemetery owner. And with most conventional cemeteries, they will have a one-time use of the grave. So it doesn't mean that you could only bury one person, because with some cemeteries and certain areas of the cemetery, you could bury 2 people, maybe even up to 4 people. But once those allotted spots have their deceased people in them, then that's it. That cannot be ever used again for anybody else, even within the same family. Some quick statistics I came across on the Green Burial Council website, and these are American-based statistics. Burials in the US use approximately 4.3 million gallons of embalming fluid, and over 800,000 of those gallons contains formaldehyde, methanol, and benzene. So because that's in our deceased bodies, that's now in our ground. 20 million board feet of hardwood, including rainforest wood. 1.6 million tons of concrete, and that would be because of the vaults or the liners that go in the grave, and also the bases that the headstones or markers are placed on. 17,000 tons of copper or bronze, 64,500 tons of steel, and caskets and vaults can leach iron, copper, lead, zinc, and cobalt. So that's conventional burial. Green burial, decedents are buried in as natural state as possible, and that starts right from their physical care. So if you're a green burial cemetery and you are truly following all of the 5 principles, which you're supposed to be, you mandate that the deceased cannot be embalmed. I will say, though, that there are embalming fluids out there that are considered to be more eco-friendly. They don't have the formalin and formaldehyde, but they still do have chemicals in them. So ideally, it's natural decedent care only. What the deceased person is laid out in is either just a natural fiber casket, so it could be just a pine box, it could be something made out of bamboo or willow, something that can just biodegrade. And you may not even need to purchase a casket. You could wrap the deceased body in a natural fiber cloth shroud. So that could be, again, something that's, like a natural cotton or linen, something made out of hemp or bamboo materials, even wool, if you've got wool to be able to use. There's no addition of the casket liner or vault that goes into the grave first. All of the green burial cemeteries have some kind of a conservancy program. So that could mean that once the grave has been, or once a decedent is buried in the grave, that they will let that spot go back to its natural state. They may help it along, so they may plant deliberate plantings, but it would all be plantings from the natural area. Or it could also mean that they might allow reuse of the grave after 40 years or a certain amount of time. There are fewer man-made structures above the ground, so you certainly won't see the mausoleums, but you also don't see all of those individual grave markers like you do at a conventional cemetery. So instead, what you may see is one large communal marker that would provide a way to honor who is in that area. And in green cemeteries, there's also a much higher use of the land for burial. So in a conventional cemetery, you'll see roadways going into the different sections. And in a green burial cemetery, they actually bury themselves out of areas, and the plan is not to ever go back into that area. So in some of the green burial cemeteries, one in particular, Royal Oak Burial Park on the island in Victoria, when it first opened up, it didn't look like much. It was surrounded by the Gary oaks and fir trees and salal and arbutus. And the area where it was meant to be green burial section was just, they had cleared the bush away, and it was kind of almost like a dirty old parking lot. But as people started to be buried and we started working our way out of the area and the natural plantings were being put in place, you really started to see what the area was going to look like. And now you go there, and the first section where they started burying, there is no road anymore. It's all gone back to natural flora and fauna. There are little pathways that they have put in so people can still walk through, but very, very different. And so that's kind of one of the important elements of a green burial cemetery. And anecdotally for me, just with my experience with families who choose green burial over conventional burial, is that there just seems to be more family involvement at the graveside. So one of the things I'll notice typically at a conventional burial, not always, but lots of times, is that after the ceremony takes place, the family will often leave and the deceased is still in their casket and suspended above the grave, and the family leaves, and then it's the cemetery staff who lower the casket in and complete that burial of the grave. In the green burials, it's usually quite the opposite. The families at the very least are staying to watch the casket be lowered all the way in, but oftentimes they're also staying either to observe the final burial, and many times to also participate in that. And that is going back to that community death care that we used to experience when my grandma was little. And another thing, that there's just this sense of a gentler, I don't know quite how to put it, but a more kind of intense experience happening. And I've struggled with why that might be, just trying to understand why that could be so different. And I think one of it is that people are intentionally choosing green burial because it's about values. And when you're being that intentional for a form of disposition, then I think they're also just being very intentional in everything they're doing around the preparation of the deceased, around the ceremonies that are taking place. And so it really comes through. So I think I'm kind of getting a little slow in my my delivery here. I'm going to speed things up a little bit, but I also really want to talk about cremation. This is important for me because so many people choose it, and because we really only have that one option. And so what we need to just keep in mind is with flame-based cremation here in BC, it's practiced by using natural gas as the fuel source to heat a chamber to about 1400 to 1600 degrees Fahrenheit for several hours sometimes. So going back to some of the stats that I've been able to key in on, and again, they're very American based, but the flame-based cremations take up the same amount of energy roughly and have the same emissions as about 2 tanks of gas in an average car. So it's considerable, the impact that flame-based cremation is having. There's very little chance of being able to recover anything from a cremation, a flame-based cremation. So the only thing you might be able to recover and possibly recycle would be implants that are made out of a high quality steel or a titanium, like a hip implant, or if you've had a badly broken leg and you've got a big pin in. Dental gold, non-recoverable. And one other important note is that in BC law, every person who's cremated must be laid out in a cremation casket of some sort. So it means it just has to be rigid, leak-proof, and fully enclosed, but it does mean that we are now using other materials that are being added in.
Ngaio is muted. So
Yeah. In some of the other jurisdictions in Canada and in the US, and more so in the US, they are able to practice what's called aquamation. And aquamation is our green alternative to cremation. So it fits into the cremation category, but it does not use flame as the main source to be able to reduce our soft tissue from our bones. It uses 1/10 of the energy that flame-based cremation does. So 90% less of a carbon footprint. Yes, it uses water and an alkaline solution, but the water at the end of the process, because of how the process works, and I won't get into all the details, not that I know all of the details, but the water solution that's left over because of the process is a sterile process or sterile fluid. It does not contain the DNA or the RNA of the deceased. And so there are cremation, aqua cremation based businesses that are offering small amounts of that water back to the families. They can take it home. They can use it as a fertilizer to water their own plants. And they're also partnering with local farmers who come and collect the water, and they'll mix it in with their own fertilizers and use it on their crops. Any of the implants that we have in our bodies, breast implants, pacemakers, any of those kinds of things, they are fully recoverable at the end. So it means we're not destroying it. It's not being part of the pollution in our atmosphere. And we now have an opportunity to recycle them. Dental gold can be recovered. The alkali part of the solution is potassium hydroxide, which is a common ingredient in our household ingredients. It's reduced 1,000 times during each of the aquamation processes. So it's virtually undetectable at the end in that remaining fluid. And finally, with aquamation, because of the process, the deceased can't go in a casket. So we're not now requiring additional purchases and additional materials to be used. So the deceased body could go in naked. Lots of people choose to also, or instead of naked, to wrap the body in a natural cloth shroud. So as long as it's natural, it could be raw silk, it could be wool or leather, can't be cotton, but you could wrap the body that way. So I am hopeful that by having these conversations that we can, more people can start to understand what options we have, where we have choices and where we don't, and start to think about how we can spread that word. I also want to say that even though so many people choose cremation, and so, therefore our environmental impact is large in BC because we don't have another option, there are other ways that we can green up our conventional options, even if you're choosing, say, conventional burial or you're choosing cremation. So, we can be mindful still with the options that we do have. We can think about carpooling when we get to gather again and go to a gathering. We can make sure to choose caskets that are made out of sustainable products. We can look at green burial where possible. And if we cannot do green burial because it's not possible in our area, talk with your cemetery and see if there are ways that they will work with you to make it as green as possible. If you're choosing cremation, again, that eco-friendly casket option is that it makes a difference. Choose something that's just made of natural wood and maybe also has cardboard mixed into the construction of it, rather than choosing something that's made of pressboard or even plywood. Those materials are full of glue. That all ends up in our atmosphere. Don't choose caskets that are made out of rainforest hardwoods. Look at recycling, using recycled wood from around you and make your own casket. So there's many other things that we can do to green up our end-of-life practices. And one other quick thing I want to just add in before we go to some questions is when I talked about green burials and how there's just this different intentionality and way about the families who seem to choose green burial, there's also this interesting tie-in of people choosing home vigils and a home funeral. And not all people do who are choosing green burial, but enough so that it's made me sit up and take notice. And so just to know that with our laws here in BC, we're not obligated to have to hire a funeral director or a funeral home business to be able to look after our deceased. We think, you know, most people, that's our automatic go-to is to do that hiring, but you don't have to. You can keep things in-house. You can keep it community-based. It does take a lot of planning and thought ahead of time. If you haven't thought about it ahead of time, then you do need a really good support group around you who can act quickly and get things into place to make that happen. But you can bring your deceased home. You can have them with you for multiple days, for several hours. You can choose to build your own casket. You can choose to do everything, including providing the transportation of the deceased person from the home to the cemetery to the crematorium. Not everybody is going to choose that option. And honestly, with the people I've worked with, there have been fewer who've done everything. But you can also look at maybe doing some of those things that are important for you, if that's a route you want to go down. And what I will say about it is, again, like that green burial where there's just this more involved experience. If you think that you want to explore home vigils or home funerals, the experience is incredibly powerful. And it takes us back to, for those of us here in our Western world, how we used to do things 100 years ago. For other cultures around the world, they may be quite surprised by what our modern death rituals are, because these are still their practices that they've kept. And, you know, because of all those reasons I mentioned in the slideshow, we've gotten away from that. But when we start to think more in depth about what our impact is going to be at the end of our life, as we have during our life, it doesn't surprise me that we start to tie that in with community death care as well. So there's so much that I could just yatter on about. And as I said, I am a bit of a funeral nerd when it comes to this. So I'm going to stop yattering, and I'll happily just engage in conversation, answer questions, whatever it is that you would like.
Great, that was excellent. Thank you so much. Sorry, I muted you temporarily. I was trying to mute a new attendee, and somehow the computer picked you instead. So
yeah, no problem.
A little question or two related to the liquid burials, because I think they may have missed a wee bit of the beginning, so that's okay. So I'm going to moderate the questions, and what people can do is actually, because I'm recording the video, I've got it on the speaker view. But I think now I'm going to switch it back to the group, the gallery view. If anybody doesn't want to be recorded, they can certainly put their video off. But I'm going to go back to the gallery view since we're into the discussion part. And people can either add their questions in the chat, or if you want to put your hand up, if you go down to the participants box, you will see a raise hand function. And in some setups, it's blue. In other setups, it's flesh colored. And so you can click on that raise hand, and then I'll see you in the participants window, and try and take them in order. And then other people that put them in the chat, I'll try and look at the chat as well. So I see a hand now for Kathy Sevcik. So go ahead and unmute yourself, Kathy, and please go ahead with your question.
I think Hans and Margot had their hand up first. Would you guys like to ask your question first and then I'll go? No? Me first? Okay. So Ngaio, I do want to know more about this, why we don't have, I'm probably going to say it wrong, but Aquamation available in British Columbia. Is that, are we governed by British Columbia laws or is it a municipal thing?
Yeah, great question. So we are governed by provincial laws, so BC laws, and that's why in some provinces in Canada, aquamation is available because those provinces have made it legal, a legal form of disposition. In BC, it hasn't happened yet. I have been engaged with people who have been doing their best to get the attention of the powers that be in our provincial government, and the message that we have received back from them loud and clear is that it's just not that big of a deal to them. It's not on their radar. They don't see it as being that important. So that's alarming and quite frustrating. But there is a bit of a groundswell happening, and maybe for others it's not really a swell, it's still a bit of a bump. One of the things I've done is I complained to my mom, who is part of the Women's Institute, and she said, oh, well, I'll just take this to the Women's Institute. And if any of you are familiar with it, it's a rural women's organization. It's across Canada, but it's international as well. And they do, a lot of people will know them for charitable functions that they put on and things like that, but they're also an advocacy group, and they have done things like that yellow line down the center of our road to keep cars separated from each other, ongoing traffic. That was them. They were the ones who advocated for that. So anyways, my mom brought it forward to her chapter. It grew from there, and now the entire Women's Institute of BC has decided to back this initiative to bring attention to the idea that we need more option in BC for cremation, and aquamation is what they're asking the government to look at. So that is one of the ways that we're trying to get the government's attention. Once it gets approved provincially, then there could be some hangups municipally, but that would just be zoning stuff. And frankly, it's probably easier for a municipal government to give permission for an aquamation operation than for a flame-based cremation operation.
Great. You can go ahead, Hans and Margot.
Okay, hi, and thanks for this information. I was on the board of the Memorial Society of British Columbia probably 10 years ago, looking into green burials and approaching different cities, and they have laws saying you have to have these cement liners. And nobody was even interested in talking about changing it. Are things getting more open, or because if you have the cement liner, that prevents the slumping, right? So they can move it easier. Then you can't have a green burial. So
that's right. So as you know, we are very highly regulated in the whole death care industry in BC, and cemeteries is clumped into that as well. And the regulations with the cemeteries are actually quite broad and general. And then each cemetery is allowed to have its own bylaws. And it's the bylaws of the cemetery that will require the liners or the vaults or not. So if it's a brand new cemetery establishing itself, so our newest one in the Lower Mainland is in South Surrey, and they established themselves as a sustainable cemetery. So they do not require that you have to have a liner or a vault. And they have one area that actually is a green burial area, so you cannot put a liner or vault in there. With other cemeteries that are existing and already have their bylaws, they have to be motivated to change their bylaws. And it can happen. So the City of Vancouver Cemetery, Mountain View Cemetery, while they are a conventional cemetery, because of the manager who they've had in place for several years now, he has made changes to their bylaws, and you are not required to have to use a vault or a liner in any of their burial plots. You can choose it or not. So they are have been given a status of a hybrid green burial cemetery because they're able to offer the practices of green burial, even though their cemetery itself still falls under that conventional. So you're right, though, cemeteries, especially the existing ones, they have to be committed to really following the 5 principles of green burial if they want to be able to truly offer that option to the public.
And do you think it would be something to, if we had a local cemetery, to actually approach them and talk to them about their bylaws?
Yes.
See if you could get it changed?
Absolutely. And right now the municipal run cemeteries are a little more open to this. So right now we really only have that new one in South Surrey that has a green burial section, and the whole cemetery is also deemed as sustainable. And then the Vancouver one is offering green burial practices. But there's the municipal cemetery in Coquitlam. They are developing a green burial section. And I know that the city of Surrey is working on a green burial section or sections for some of their cemeteries, and they have 3 cemeteries. So it's a bit of a slow process. I have spoken with the cemetery, all of the heads of cemeteries for municipal cemeteries in the Lower Mainland. I did a presentation for them on green burial, and there was a lot of quietness in the room. And that was several years ago. So, you know, now seeing that, or knowing that there are at least 2 other municipalities who are starting to get on board, it's encouraging, but it is a slow process.
On the subject of Aquamation, who do we need to write to prod and push for Aquamation?
Yeah, so your local MLA, there is a petition that you can sign on change.org, and I did send several pages of resources out. I'm not sure if Cindy has some that can be shared with all of you who are participating tonight, so you'll get that link. So there's a petition to sign, but definitely talking to your local MLA. Yeah, that, and you know, even the the Memorial Society of BC. So their executive director now, Stephen Garrett, he is a friend of green burial and Aquamation. But you know, he's got a large plate and a lot of things on his plate. So the more prods he gets from people other than me, then the better it is.
Thank you. I've got a question from Catherine. Do you want to speak your question, Catherine? You may have just written it in the chat just so that you could think it out. And if you want to speak it, go ahead. If not, I can speak it for you. Go ahead.
I'll just read what I wrote. Probably everyone can see it anyway. What do you expect will happen eventually to conventional graveyards? And in older parts of the world, what has happened? And are they ever repurposed?
Yeah, so there is great possibility for conventional cemeteries to maintain an element of that tradition, but to become more sustainable in their practices. And the one that I would point to say that it can happen, again, is at Mountain View Cemetery in Vancouver. So because of the changes they've made to their bylaws, it means that although they're not deemed as a proper green burial cemetery, if you have property there, you could, for all intents and purposes, have a green burial. You could go, they accept people to be buried in just a shroud, or you can use a biodegradable casket. You do not have to purchase a vault or a liner. You do not have to put a marker on, even though, you know, probably all the other graves around you will have a marker. The only thing that you won't be free to do is to do your own plantings on there. And of course, know that the rest of the cemetery is still going to be as it is. The other important thing that they've done is they are now allowing for grave reuse in that cemetery. So after a period of 40 years, at first it started out with, after a period of 40 years, then a person in the same family could reuse that grave. So, you know, potentially One family could buy 1 or 2 graves and just keep reusing it. Now they've taken the step of allowing non-related people to also share a grave. So that's been quite a big move for a conventional cemetery. And those are the kinds of steps that conventional cemeteries can start to make.
That's really interesting. Wow. Very interesting. So, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I can't quite figure out the hand raising thing.
Fine, I see you. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I thank you again for your presentation. It was really great. And I think you and Catherine bring up some good thoughts about land use, in addition to, you know, the green burial versus non-green burial. I live in the UK, or lived in the UK for a while, and it was funny that you don't buy a grave, you rent a grave for about 40 years, and then after 40 years, next person is in. And also with, you know, their land is much, space use is a bigger issue there. And it's really interesting, some of the older cemeteries that are filled up, they're trying to turn into community spaces, which I think is really, really lovely. So there's butterfly gardens, and I think that's a really good thought that we should, as a society, should be thinking about as well. I live near Mountain View, and it's lovely. And during the start of the pandemic, you know, nobody could go hiking, nobody could go outside. Like, where can you go and then, you know, just get out of your basement apartment? And a lot of people were going to Mountain View because it's open, it's safe, but there's signs up everywhere saying basically only morning people allowed. And yeah, while there's good, that makes, on some level it makes sense, but you know, in the long term, does that really make sense? And I had a question for you too. We're very fortunate in our society today that we don't die the way we used to. We have all sorts of good drugs. Is there concern with green burials about those drugs getting into the water system?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a question that gets asked over and over again. And I don't have all the scientific information at my fingertips, but I do know from having listened to that question being asked and answered that the short answer is no, it's not a big concern. And at the end of the day, the earth itself, the way the microbes work in the earth, it helps to kind of flush out and break down. There's not a big enough concentration of chemicals in our bodies to leach into the ground or groundwater to make it a danger. And one of the other things that happens with green burial too, if it's being done properly, is that the body or the grave is not dug as deeply, so that those actions with the earth, the natural decomposition, can happen at a quicker pace and more robustly. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I thought part of the reason for the deep grave was so microbes and whatnot didn't make it out.
Yeah.
That's not the case?
No, I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but from what I have been told, the deep grave, that is, about being able to have room for the casket and enough room for the earth to be packed on top of it and be pressed down enough to, for there not to be that big cave in. When the graves were hand dug, they were not dug as deeply as they are with the machines. And certainly in the cemeteries that are allowing multiple people to be buried on top of each other, up to 4 people, you need the machine to be able to dig down that deep. Yeah. Yeah. And just to your point about the thinking of the land use, when it comes to our cemeteries, I was attending the first Green Burial Council conference virtually in October. And I was listening to a presentation by a woman who is the head of a cemetery in Pennsylvania, a green burial cemetery. And it was just outside of one of their big cities, and I've forgotten which one, but they considered it still an urban cemetery. And the way she talked about it, like if you tuned out for a second, you wouldn't even realize she was talking about a cemetery, because she was talking about the animal program they have going on there, the bee program, the gardening program, like the, you know, the reforestation program. It was amazing what they were using it for. And that really is one of the strong tenets of green burial, is that we think about how the land is being used. And it could be that it's just going to be for burial and then back to the wild, and it's going to be used not by people so much as by the natural environment. But we can also think about how we as people can keep using it over and over again. Yeah. And there's so many other areas in the world, like the UK, that they're just leaps and bounds ahead of us when it comes to green burial and being kind of more open to alternative practices. Even in the US, another woman I was listening to, she's a funeral director in Oregon, doesn't have her own cemetery, but works with other cemeteries as we do up here. And she was talking about how they can do backyard burials in Oregon. So, you know, there is a process that they have to work through with their local government, but it's allowed. And I was stunned, because in BC, you just can't. I mean, I shouldn't say that. There is a process, but it's virtually, I shouldn't say impossible, but it'd be very, very difficult to be able to get a portion of your land deemed a burial site on your property. And you certainly couldn't do it when somebody died. So if you already hadn't done that and gone through those steps, and it can take years to get it, months at the very quickest. But there in Oregon, you can just say, oh my goodness, Uncle Joe died and he wanted to be buried out, you know, in the back 40, and they can, under, you know, many, certain circumstances, they can make that happen. So there's so much for BC to draw on, and we just need to get with it.
Interesting. I've got another question from Hans and Margot.
Let me just press. If there is one kind of backyard burial that's still sort of allowed in BC, I believe, because they still take place. And we live on a boat, you see, so burial at sea is still one of the options, isn't it?
Are you talking like for a full body burial at sea?
Yes.
So to my knowledge, you have to be out in international waters. So that's what is it, 200 kilometers or so beyond the country's boundary. And again, to my knowledge, it's only, I think if you're doing it in Canadian waters, it can only be a naval vessel that performs a sea burial. So it's also quite regulated as to how that can happen.
So the burials at sea that we're familiar with, they were basically illegal, or well, how shall I rephrase it? They were under the radar, so to speak, because we know of a couple of burials at sea that took place in northern BC, and we thought that was accepted and allowed. We didn't realize that was not.
Yeah, so if they were that 200 kilometers off the Canadian waters, no. So unless they somehow got some special permission, it's not allowed. Yeah. So, so as I said, you could apply for a portion of your property to be deemed as a cemetery, but it's quite a process to go through. And it's the same process that an organization who wants to set up a cemetery for the public to use has to go through. So it's not like there's a different process for private individuals or families to go through. And then the only other scenario is if the person who dies happens to have died in an area that's impossible to get to or really unsafe for other humans to get to, then the body can be left where it is, and that will be sanctioned. But otherwise, you must be buried in a cemetery that is licensed by the government of BC.
Interesting. Well, that might be worth looking into, Hans and Margot. You guys would be able to use your boat to get out the right distance anyway. So we're at about 8 o'clock now, and I just wanted to give Ngaio a great big thank you for this absolutely fascinating presentation. I've learned so much. You mentioned about the resources that you were going to make available. Generally, what we do is we tape these meetings and then we put them on the YouTube channel.
Okay.
Marie Witt is our main tech person, but she's not with us this evening. So she will attach the resources to them later on, and that should be available with the recording on the YouTube channel.
Oh, great.
If not, anybody that, anything should go awry, like the recording that I'm doing for the first time tonight doesn't work out, then, you can get in touch with any of us in the Action Evening team, myself, Catherine Hembling, Lynn Armstrong, or Marie, and we can get the resources to you. But this has been absolutely fascinating. Normally we'll actually go a little longer, so I've got a few hands if a couple people want to stick around and continue, but I just wanted to really officially say thank you to all the people that's come out tonight and participated in this absolutely fascinating evening, and Ngaio for your really great presentation. And so that way people can feel like they can leave and say, put your microphone on, say thank you. And then we'll take I would like a show of hands if any people would still like to continue. Can you physically put your hands up? I'm going to stop the recording now. And just so that the people that are muted might decide they want to, or that videos are off. So I'm going to stop the recording. You want to stop recording? Yeah.